Tonight, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy executed the single most devastating asymmetric naval operation in modern military history, an operation so catastrophic in its immediate consequences and so irreversible in its strategic implications that every naval power on Earth is currently conducting emergency threat assessments of their own maritime vulnerabilities. The number that Tehran unleashed into the Strait of Hormuz at 0347 local time this morning exceeds 1,200 explosive-laden fast attack craft, a swarm deployment 30 times beyond the threshold that U.S. Naval Forces Central Command identified as manageable through conventional defensive measures, and that number does not account for the subsurface component or the anti-ship ballistic missile umbrella that turned 21 miles of strategic choke point into the world's first genuine maritime exclusion zone, enforced entirely through asymmetric means. The USS Bataan, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship displacing 40,000 tons and carrying the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit with its full complement of F-35B Lightning II aircraft, AV-8B Harriers, and CH-53E Super Stallion helicopters, is currently resting in 190 meters of water, 17 nautical miles southeast of the Strait's narrowest transit corridor. 1,200 United States Marines and sailors are confirmed lost. The vessel that represented the cornerstone of American amphibious power projection in the Central Command area of responsibility, the platform that provided the United States with the capability to project 2,500 combat-ready Marines anywhere in the Persian Gulf within 48 hours, no longer exists as a functioning military asset. The ship that Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin personally visited 4 months ago to reinforce America's ironclad commitment to freedom of navigation in international waters, the ship that conducted joint exercises with Bahraini and Emirati naval forces just 6 weeks ago, is gone, and with it has gone something far more consequential than 40,000 tons of steel and aluminum. What sank in those waters was American naval dominance in the Persian Gulf, the credibility of layered defensive architecture against swarm tactics, and the psychological foundation of deterrence that has kept this waterway open for 5 decades. But the loss of the Bataan is merely the tactical opening of a strategic catastrophe still unfolding in real time. The Strait of Hormuz, through which 21% of global petroleum supply transits daily, through which 17 million barrels of crude oil passed yesterday, is now effectively closed to commercial shipping. Lloyd's of London has declared the waterway an exclusion zone for insurance purposes as of 0900 Greenwich Mean Time. Brent crude futures opened Asian trading at $412 per barrel before trading was halted. The economic implications of this closure, if sustained beyond 72 hours, include fuel shortages across South Asia and East Asia within 2 weeks, recession-level economic contraction across petroleum importing economies within 30 days, and inflation spikes that will dwarf the 2022 energy crisis that followed the Ukraine invasion. If this channel has been cutting through the noise of official Pentagon briefings and mainstream defense commentary to show you what is actually happening at the sharp edge of naval warfare evolution, right now is the moment to make absolutely certain you never miss an update. Subscribe to this channel, activate the notification bell, and share this analysis with everyone in your network who needs to understand that the rules of maritime combat have permanently changed in the last 18 hours. The analysis you are about to receive covers dimensions of this event that will not appear in any Western media coverage for days if they appear at all. Tonight's deep examination takes you inside every critical dimension of this operation. The technical architecture of the swarm deployment and why American Aegis-equipped destroyers proved catastrophically ineffective against distributed low-signature threats. The operational planning that allowed IRGC Navy to coordinate 1,200 individual attack craft into synchronized assault packages that overwhelmed every defensive layer simultaneously. The strategic calculations in Tehran that determined this was the optimal moment to demonstrate that American carrier strike groups and amphibious ready groups are obsolete platforms in confined littoral environments. The immediate tactical consequences for the 11 American warships currently operating in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman with no viable extraction route. The regional implications as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Kuwait recognize that their security guarantor cannot protect maritime traffic through the waterway that their economies depend on absolutely. The global ramifications as China, Russia, and every maritime power reassess what naval dominance actually means when a 40,000-ton capital ship can be sunk by craft that cost $8,000 each. The operation that unfolded in the pre-dawn darkness of the Strait of Hormuz represents the validation of asymmetric naval warfare theory that Pentagon planners have dismissed for 2 decades as tactically interesting but strategically irrelevant. What occurred in those waters is the practical demonstration that swarm tactics, when executed with sufficient scale and coordination against conventional naval architecture designed for 20th century threat paradigms, render traditional surface combatants functionally defenseless. The loss of the Bataan is not an isolated tactical setback that can be absorbed within normal operational risk parameters. It is the empirical proof that the United States Navy's $500 billion surface fleet is optimized for a form of warfare that no longer exists, while being catastrophically vulnerable to a form of warfare that adversaries have spent 2 decades perfecting. The IRGC Navy suicide boat, designated PACAP class in Western intelligence assessments, represents the ultimate expression of cost asymmetry warfare. Each craft is a modified civilian speedboat hull, measuring 7 meters in length, powered by twin outboard motors, producing combined output of 400 horsepower, capable of speeds exceeding 60 knots in calm seas. The explosive payload varies by mission profile but typically consists of between 200 and 400 kilograms of military-grade explosives configured for contact detonation. The guidance system combines commercial GPS navigation with terminal phase operator control, allowing the craft to execute autonomous transit to target area followed by operator-directed final attack approach. The crew consists of a single operator who may or may not survive impact, depending on whether they are conducting genuine martyrdom operations or employing the vessel's emergency egress system that allows operator extraction seconds before impact. The strategic genius of the PACAP platform is not in its individual capability, but in its unit economics and mass producibility. Each craft costs between $6,000 and $10,000 to produce, using entirely commercial off-the-shelf components available through global maritime supply chains. Iran has demonstrated capacity to manufacture these platforms at rates exceeding 200 units per month across distributed production facilities that cannot be effectively targeted through airstrikes without massive civilian infrastructure damage. The cost-exchange ratio, when deployed against American surface combatants, is approximately 1 to 100,000 when targeting Aegis destroyers and 1 to 5 million when targeting amphibious assault ships or aircraft carriers. The mathematics of attrition warfare become absurd when the defender must expend $5 million SM-2 interceptor missiles against $8,000 attack boats, and when the attacker can replace losses faster than the defender can replenish interceptor magazines. The defensive architecture that the United States Navy deployed to protect the Bataan and its accompanying amphibious ready group consisted of multiple integrated layers designed to provide overlapping coverage against aerial, surface, and subsurface threats. The outermost layer consisted of E-2D Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft providing radar coverage of surface contacts at ranges exceeding 200 nautical miles. The intermediate layer consisted of MH-60R Seahawk helicopters equipped with surface search radar and Hellfire missiles for prosecution of surface contacts identified as threats. The inner layer consisted of the escort destroyers USS Gravely and USS Delbert D. Black, both Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers equipped with Aegis combat systems, SPY-1D phased array radars, and SM-2 surface-to-air missiles that possess secondary anti-surface capability. This defensive architecture, which represents the most sophisticated layered protection system ever deployed for naval force protection, failed completely when confronted with a threat that it was never designed to engage. The fundamental problem is not inadequate sensor capability or insufficient interceptor inventory, but rather the mismatch between defensive system design assumptions and actual threat characteristics. The Aegis combat system was optimized to detect, track, and engage small numbers of high-value aerial threats like anti-ship cruise missiles and fighter aircraft. The system's radar processing algorithms, fire control logic, and weapon assignment protocols were built around the assumption that any given engagement would involve tracking and engaging between 5 and 20 simultaneous targets presenting high radar cross-sections and following predictable ballistic or aerodynamic flight paths. What the Aegis system confronted in the Strait of Hormuz was 1,200 low-signature surface contacts appearing simultaneously across a 200-degree arc at ranges varying from 40 kilometers to 4 kilometers, traveling at speeds between 40 and 65 knots, executing random evasive maneuvers, and presenting radar cross-sections barely distinguishable from fishing vessels, pleasure craft, and commercial traffic that routinely operates in these waters. The radar system could detect the contacts but could not process threat assessment fast enough to generate fire control solutions. The SM-2 missiles, even if launched at maximum magazine capacity, could engage perhaps 40 targets before magazine depletion. The 5-inch deck guns could engage additional targets but lacked sufficient traverse rate and ammunition capacity to address threats arriving from multiple vectors simultaneously. The close-in weapon systems, the final defensive layer consisting of radar-guided 20mm Gatling cannons, could engage targets within 2 kilometers, but face the mathematical impossibility of engaging hundreds of targets arriving within 30-second windows. The operational execution that IRGC Navy demonstrated reveals sophisticated understanding of American defensive capabilities and deliberate exploitation of identified vulnerabilities. The attack was not a chaotic mass wave, but rather a carefully orchestrated sequence of assault packages timed to overwhelm defensive response capacity while preventing effective triage of threats. The first wave consisted of approximately 300 craft approaching from the southern vector directly out of Iranian territorial waters near Keshem Island. This wave triggered defensive response from the destroyer screen, forcing expenditure of interceptor missiles and focusing defensive attention on the southern approach. 8 minutes after initial contact, while the destroyers were cycling through intercept sequences and reprioritizing targets, the second wave of 400 craft emerged from concealed positions along the Iranian coastline to the east, presenting an entirely new threat axis that required reorientation of defensive sensors and weapon systems. 6 minutes later, while defensive coordinators were attempting to develop engagement solutions for threats arriving from 2 vectors simultaneously, the third wave of 500 craft accelerated from holding positions to the north, creating a 3-axis threat envelope that rendered conventional defensive doctrine impossible to execute. The Bataan's commanding officer faced impossible tactical mathematics. The ship was designed to operate as the center of an amphibious-ready group, with escort destroyers providing area defense, while the ship itself focused on aviation operations and amphibious assault preparation. The defensive armament aboard the Bataan itself consists of 2 rolling airframe missile launchers, with 21 interceptors each, 2 CRAM close-in weapon systems, and small arms. Against a distributed swarm attack arriving from multiple vectors simultaneously, these systems could engage perhaps 60 targets maximum before ammunition depletion. The escorting destroyers, themselves managing hundreds of simultaneous threat tracks, could provide limited support, but were managing their own defensive perimeters against craft specifically targeting them. The Bataan attempted emergency maneuvers to present minimum profile to the primary attack axis while launching all available helicopters to provide additional defensive firepower. The physics of ship handling prevented meaningful evasive action, as a 40,000-ton vessel requires several minutes and thousands of meters to execute significant course changes. The helicopters, armed with door-mounted machine guns and limited Hellfire missile inventories, engaged targets but were overwhelmed by the density of the attack. At 04:02 local time, the first explosive-laden craft impacted the Bataan's port side at the waterline, penetrating the hull below the vehicle deck. The second impact occurred 17 seconds later on the starboard quarter. Within 90 seconds, 11 separate impacts had occurred across the ship's hull, several achieving hits at or below the waterline that compromised watertight integrity across multiple compartments simultaneously. The damage control teams aboard the Bataan confronted catastrophic flooding in multiple isolated compartments with no ability to control ingress or establish effective dewatering. The progressive flooding created lists that accelerated as additional compartments were compromised. The commanding officer ordered abandon ship at 04:28 local time, 16 minutes after initial impact. The vessel capsized at 04:47 and slipped beneath the surface at 05:03. The destroyer USS Delbert D. Black maneuvered to provide search and rescue support, but was itself struck by 3 suicide craft during rescue operations, suffering moderate damage and 14 casualties while successfully recovering 417 survivors from the Bataan. 809 personnel from the Bataan remain unaccounted for and are presumed lost. What is unfolding right now in the Persian Gulf is not merely a tactical defeat for a single naval vessel, but the operational collapse of American ability to maintain naval presence in confined waters against adversaries employing distributed asymmetric platforms. The 11 American warships currently operating in the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman include the aircraft carrier USS Dwight D. Eisenhower with its accompanying carrier strike group of 4 destroyers and 1 cruiser, 2 additional destroyers operating independently, 1 supply ship, and 3 patrol craft. Every one of these vessels is now operating in an environment where the threat demonstrated against the Bataan can be replicated at will by IRGC Navy forces operating from dozens of coastal facilities and hundreds of commercial vessels that can serve as launch platforms for suicide craft deployments. The strategic dilemma facing U.S. Naval Forces Central Command is absolute. The vessels cannot remain in the Persian Gulf indefinitely while facing continuous threat of swarm attacks that their defensive systems cannot effectively counter. The vessels cannot safely transit outbound through the Strait of Hormuz while Iranian forces control both shorelines and can launch attacks from positions that provide minimal warning time. The vessels cannot be reinforced by additional surface combatants because those reinforcements would need to transit the Strait of Hormuz to reach the Persian Gulf. The vessels cannot be effectively defended by air power alone because fighter aircraft cannot maintain continuous coverage and lack the precision engagement capability necessary to distinguish hostile suicide craft from legitimate civilian maritime traffic in one of the world's most congested waterways. The Pentagon is facing the most acute naval crisis since the Cuban Missile Crisis, a situation where significant American naval forces are effectively trapped in hostile waters with no good options for extraction or reinforcement. The discussions occurring right now in the National Military Command Center involve scenarios that have not been seriously contemplated since 1962. The option of negotiating safe passage involves acknowledging that Iran controls the waterway and that American naval forces require Iranian permission to exit, a humiliation that would permanently destroy American credibility as a security guarantor for Gulf Arab states. The option of fighting through the strait involves accepting likely additional ship losses and potentially thousands of additional casualties in exchange for demonstrating that American forces will not be deterred by asymmetric threats. The option of maintaining position involves accepting indefinite vulnerability to additional attacks while petroleum prices continue climbing and global economic consequences continue compounding. Every percentage point of American strategic attention consumed by this crisis is a percentage point not applied to Ukraine, not applied to Taiwan contingency planning, not applied to NATO's eastern flank, creating pressure relief across every theater where adversaries face American opposition. Russia is already increasing pressure on Ukrainian positions in Donetsk. China is increasing air incursions into Taiwan's air defense identification zone. North Korea has conducted 3 ballistic missile tests in the past 12 hours. The global correlation of forces is shifting in real time as adversaries recognize that American capability to project power simultaneously across multiple theaters is being tested to destruction. The regional implications are equally catastrophic for American strategic position. Saudi Arabia, which has conducted 5 emergency National Security Council meetings in the past 18 hours, is confronting the reality that its petroleum exports, which constitute 60% of government revenue, depend on maritime routes that the United States cannot protect. The UAE, which hosts American air bases and has positioned itself as America's primary Gulf partner, is recognizing that partnership with a security guarantor that cannot guarantee security is a liability rather than an asset. Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, every Gulf state that has relied on American naval power to ensure freedom of navigation is reassessing that reliance. The phone calls between Gulf capitals and Tehran have already begun. The discussions about accommodation, about neutrality, about realignment are happening right now. The global economic consequences are compounding by the hour. Japan, which imports 90% of its petroleum through the Strait of Hormuz, is facing energy security crisis. South Korea, India, China, every major Asian economy is conducting emergency cabinet meetings on petroleum supply security. The International Energy Agency has announced coordinated strategic petroleum reserve releases, but those reserves can sustain consumption for perhaps 90 days. If the strait remains closed beyond that window, the global economy enters uncharted territory. Fuel rationing, transportation system collapse, industrial production halts, food supply chain disruption, every nightmare scenario that energy security planners have wargamed is becoming operational reality. If you want analysis this sharp, this deep, this willing to challenge the official Pentagon narrative that is currently claiming this situation is manageable, subscribe to this channel right now to ensure you never miss an update as this crisis continues escalating. The broader implications for American naval architecture and force structure planning are profound and irreversible. The United States Navy has spent 70 years and trillions of dollars optimizing surface fleet design for blue water power projection against peer naval competitors. The Carrier Strike Group, the Amphibious Ready Group, the Destroyer Escort Screen, this entire architecture is built around the assumption that American technological superiority in sensors, weapons, and integrated combat systems provides decisive advantage against any adversary. What the loss of the Bataan demonstrates is that technological superiority is irrelevant when the adversary refuses to fight according to the doctrinal assumptions that American systems are designed around. Iran did not attempt to defeat the Bataan in conventional naval combat. Iran did not deploy destroyers or frigates or submarines to engage in the kind of fleet action that American naval forces are optimized to win. Iran deployed 1,200 expendable craft costing less than $10 million combined to sink a 40,000-ton capital ship worth $3 billion, carrying assets worth an additional $2 billion. The cost-exchange ratio is 500 to 1 in Iran's favor. The strategic impact is incalculable. The demonstration effect for every potential American adversary is complete. China is watching. Russia is watching. North Korea is watching. Every navy that faces potential conflict with the United States now understands that American surface combatants are vulnerable to tactics that completely bypass the defensive systems that make those ships dominant in conventional engagement scenarios. The question that will drive strategic planning for the next decade is whether surface naval power projection remains viable in an era where distributed low-cost platforms can overwhelm the defensive capacity of high-value capital ships. The answer may be that the aircraft carrier, the amphibious assault ship, the large surface combatant, these platforms that have defined naval power for 80 years, are approaching obsolescence just as the battleship became obsolete when faced with carrier aviation. The irony is that American naval dominance may be ending not through technological defeat by peer competitors, but through asymmetric tactics employed by regional powers using commercial technology. The world that existed yesterday, where American carrier strike groups could operate with impunity in any ocean, where the Strait of Hormuz remained open because American naval power guaranteed it remained open, where energy supplies flowed freely because American maritime dominance ensured freedom of navigation, that world no longer exists. What is emerging is a world where regional powers can employ asymmetric capabilities to deny access to American forces, where critical maritime choke points can be closed through distributed threats that conventional naval power cannot counter, where the economic foundations of globalized trade are vulnerable to disruption that major powers cannot prevent. The Pentagon will eventually extract the remaining naval forces from the Persian Gulf. American diplomatic pressure, potential concessions to Iran, perhaps direct military action to suppress Iranian coastal facilities sufficiently to create transit windows, some combination of measures will eventually resolve the immediate tactical situation. But the strategic damage is permanent. The demonstration that American naval forces can be defeated, that American security guarantees are conditional on Iranian permission, that the global economic system can be held hostage by asymmetric capabilities, these demonstrations cannot be undone. The credibility that took decades to build has been destroyed in 18 hours. The alliances that depended on that credibility are fracturing right now. The world order that American naval power underwrote is collapsing in real time. Subscribe to this channel because in a world this dangerous, analysis this sharp is not optional, it is necessary. Share this video with everyone in your network who needs to understand that the rules of maritime power have permanently changed. The world will never be the same after tonight. There is no going back. History will mark this moment as the end of American naval dominance and the beginning of an era where oceans are no longer highways for American power projection, but contested spaces where regional powers can deny access through capabilities that American military superiority cannot overcome. Stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop questioning the official narratives that will attempt to minimize what has actually occurred in the Strait of Hormuz.